Salve friends, and welcome to the finale of our Rome 2 Total War Divide Et Impera immersive playthrough. I am sure you will take from the opening sentence that a lot is going to happen in this rendition. But first, I wanted to thank every one of you who's tuned in so far. I appreciate the channel growth surrounding these videos and the YouTube in general. The DEI recaps have been an absolute labour of love, to quote the Steam Awards. I've enjoyed streaming these and turning them into recaps, but for the hours that go into making them, the audience simply isn't there. So I'll probably be shelving these for the foreseeable, and we will see what the future holds. They could always reappear. But yeah, anyway. The war in Greece was beginning to rage on, and aggressions were flowing. The Aridae were at peace with us, however remained an untrustworthy faction of whom we now shared a border. The decision was made to launch a preemptive attack and remove them from the equation. We declared on them officially and launched a cross-border attack, immediately sieging their only settlement, trapping their army inside. A slaughter was on the cards. As we marched towards the settlement, we realised the enemy had actually sallied out to fight us in the field. An inconvenience to say the least. We deployed our army on some favourable terrain and dug in for the enemy's approach. Due to our use of ballista, they would have to close the gap, otherwise we would continue to pester them from range with our projectiles. The enemy began advancing, the entire time our flaming balls dropping onto their tightly packed hoplite formations until they got into skirmisher range and the peltasts began pelting. The front lines then clashed while our cavalry began flanking the enemy and attempting to engage their skirmishers. The desperate scrambled force the enemy brought to face us was simply not as well equipped. Our pikes held firm, accompanied with our infantry, while our ballista slowed down any enemy approach. Before long we had the enemy surrounded, and through cavalry hammer and anvil tactics, coupled with elephants, the defensive force the enemy had mustered began to crumble. With Naissos under our rule, we could now concentrate fully on mainland Greece. However, one eye would have to be maintained on Rhodes, as it served as an excellent position for the enemy to springboard into Anatolia. We then seized the initiative by moving our famed Nicator Guard, commanded by our now King Antiochus II, into position, sieging Pella, the ancestral capital of the Macedonian Empire. We managed to surround the city with 3 full armies totalling over 13,000 men. With such overwhelming numbers, the decision was taken to delegate command to our seasoned generals, and the enemy's resistance was futile. We now had the heart of Alexander the Great's empire under our control. With this new stronghold, no time was wasted heading south. Larissa was wide open for the taking, and it was too good an opportunity to pass up. Our army marched into the settlement, and with little resistance, they bent the knee. We were starting to get the impression that the Greek city-states would rather be consolidated under Seleucid rule. Just as an aura of competence was settling in, a large Athenian navy attacked and sieged Tyros with assistance from the local pirates, a true sign of the depths of their desperation. Unfortunately, one of our previous concerns manifested itself into reality. Rhodes had attacked our satrapy Sardes and taken their capital for their own. This meant that they had a foothold on Anatolia where we had little resistance. On top of this issue, food was fast becoming an issue once again, as we had significantly expanded without increasing our infrastructure. Alternatively, the siege of Athens was coming to a head. Our badly battered and exhausted troops were asked to once more take to the field, this time to extinguish the threat from Athens on mainland Greece. We began battering the enemy's walls with our ballista, and aimed to flatten a significant section before entering the breach. Meanwhile, 2 of our hastily assembled ladders would be manned by our veteran hoplites and assault a further section of the walls, hoping to split the enemy's defensive efforts. As the hoplites battling atop the walls drew attention, our forces poured into the extensive breach, scrambling to set up a defensive point on the inside of the wall. The defensive wall of Peltas would have to stand the test of the enemy's onslaught, while our slingers rained in projectiles from above, and our elephants hit the enemy and then reformed to go at them again. As we began breaking the enemy at the breach, it was sadly realised that our 2 hoplites that had been sent to distract the enemy had been killed to a man atop the walls. A truly sad end to units that had served our current commander and king, as well as his father, in every corner of our sprawling kingdom. There was no time to mourn though, and with a few more well-placed elephant charges, the enemy broke, and all that was left to do now was reform and steadily approach the heart of Athens, where some defence would surely remain. As we reassembled and our forces approached the main square, They were ambushed by some of the enemy's badly bloodied forces that our hoplites had managed to damage. We converged our skirmishers on these forces and dispatched of them with ease. The focus now turned to the town square. The enemy commander stood alone with his elite bodyguard unit defending the entrance to the democratic heart of Athens. We began absolutely leathering their elite hoplites with what ammo we had left. Then, slowly, we moved in every available warrior we had, converging upon this unit, slaughtering them to a man, thus stamping out the Athenian resistance from the peninsula. With most of mainland Greece now under our control, focus fell upon Sparta. These renowned warriors were not historically part of Alexander's empire, but they were vulnerable to attack, having lost most of their allies. As seems to be the norm with us, there was no time to toast our historic victory. Rhodes had launched an attack from Sardes upon Pergamon, where we had only garrisoned an experienced governor accompanied with some local axemen to aid our local defensive efforts. This was Rhodes' elite army that had been sacking and destroying the local countryside. There would be no quarter offered. Our local militia offered to garrison the walls, where our local cavalry accompanied by our general would flank the enemy's forces and aim to launch surprise hit and run tactics from the woods. As soon as the enemy's cumbersome towers approached the walls, the trap was sprung, led by the governor himself. The aim was to eliminate the enemy's skirmishers so only the infantry remained. After a series of successful hit and runs, our cavalry, battered and bruised, retreated round the outside of the walls and back into the safety of the fort. These cavalry would be needed once again as the fight for the walls had begun. Our local garrison militia had succumbed to the enemy and fled into the city. The regular hoplites were now all that stood, supported by the axemen. After an hours long melee with some serious back and forth, we eventually cornered the majority of the enemy's forces in and around the gate, and after converging everything we had at once upon them, routed them from the field. The city of Pergamon was safe, for now. With a successful defence behind us, we looked towards the coast and readied ourselves for the next move. However, we found ourselves on the offensive. We assaulted what remained of Rhodes and Sardes, and rather than returning the city to our former satrapy, we decided to take over control firsthand, as more conflict was not far away. Unfortunately, another Rhodian army had ventured from their capital, and this time they attacked and sacked side, taking it for themselves. This war still had some fire in it yet. On the other side of our empire, we had managed to muster a small offensive force supported by our navy and made our way towards Tyros. We seized the city and realised the magnitude of the task that we had given our troops that were in place. We only had around 500 infantry, supported by roughly the same amount of cavalry, as well as our fleet on the sea. Our plan was simple. We engaged the enemy's naval forces, defeat them, and then move swiftly through the town to assist our land forces. These fresh warriors were placed atop a hill just outside of the town and told to strike down anything that tried to summit the mound. Our cavalry would be nearby, hitting and running, keeping the enemy occupied and on edge. As the naval forces engaged, our superiority was made immediately clear. We managed to sink a number of the enemy's vessels before even closing in for rams due to our ballista ships. A number of volleys followed up with some close combat saw the enemy navy sinking or fleeing for their lives. Their job was done. The job of our infantry had just started. 2 units of pikemen supported by royal peltasts had to hold the hill. They knew their task and performed immensely in their defensive efforts, buying our cavalry the time needed to inflict the required damage. With a final well-timed swing of our cavalry arm, it was not long before the enemy did not know which way to face, never mind fight, and they were broken. We were so successful in our tactical prowess, our navy didn't even have to set foot on land. Tyros was back in Seleucid hands. Despite our frequent decisive victories over Rhodes, their main army was still advancing through central Anatolia. Iconium was next to suffer at their hands. Antiochus II was furious and demanded that Sparta be dealt with. It was decided there had been enough insult thrown at us to warrant the conquering of Sparta, and the elite Nicator Guard were sent to siege the once great city. We brought ballista. Let us see how their famous walls would hold out. These walls were of course referring to the Spartan elite, who scrambled to meet our infantry in their tight wangling streets. Something that would prove to be of immense advantage to us, as our ballista rained in fire relentlessly. Our archers and slingers then joined this barrage as our royal peltasts began flanking, accompanied by our cavalry, who would strike when the opportunity presented itself. We exhausted most of our skirmish units' ammo and allowed the Spartans to run at our pikes, before we committed more or less every single infantry unit we could. The Spartans were still standing their ground. They were quite literally just built differently, and it would be a war of attrition between each side's infantry. Victory or loss, casualties were going to be high. We eventually managed to kill the enemy general and encircled what remained of the enemy's forces, and victory was achieved. With this colossal win, Sparta was no more, and the entirety of the Greek mainland now belonged to us. The only holdouts were the islands of Crete and Rhodes. With so many battles and isolated enemies to fight, we began reorganising our forces and placing small garrisons around our coastline to hopefully assist in thwarting enemy attacks. The Imotekiates, led by Seleucids III, were the next to combat Rhodes. The last Rhodian army on the mainland attempted to navigate one of the tight passes in the mountains of Anatolia, only to find it occupied by our brave warriors. This army was somewhat attritioned and battle weary. Nonetheless, a defence was mounted, focused around a makeshift fort. The enemy came pouring straight at us and fierce combat ensued. Our pikes stood firm at the small gap, and after a ferocious initial charge, our cavalry and peltasts began flanking manoeuvres while the enemy tried to stop the inevitable from happening. We even had the audacity to slowly wheel our ballista into position to add to the slaughter. In what seemed like the blink of an eye, we turned the pack entrance to the fort into an oven. Our surrounding walls were set alight, and our pikemen in the fort held firmly. After a number of ballista volleys, it was the combined infantry and cavalry's turn. A full encirclement was orchestrated to absolute perfection, and with the enemy's retreat cut off, they were cut down to a man. With this total victory, we brought Rhodian occupation to an end on the mainland, and our full focus turned to invading the last Greek holdouts. From the map you can see they were consolidated to the south of our kingdom in the Aegean Sea. With both of the holdouts being islands, it was decided we would go for a combined land and sea assault on each. Our initial operation was to siege the capital of Crete from both land and sea, hoping to force a pitched battle. Upon arrival, what remained of the Athenian navy attempted to break the blockade, but failed miserably. With such overwhelming numbers and attrition having depleted the defenders to a position of weakness, command was delegated to our generals, and before we knew it, Athens, our once great enemy, were destroyed, and no more. Only Rhodes remained. Our warriors here were quickly resupplied and allowed to replenish, and we pressed home our advantage and moved to siege the last holdout of Rhodes. The final battle of this campaign, we repeated our feats in Crete, surrounded Rhodes from both land and sea, and delegated command to our generals for this battle. We won handsomely, however we did take considerable casualties. This final victory meant the campaign was won, as we had achieved what the Council had initially set out as our objective. We had reclaimed Alexander's empire, and in certain areas had even expanded upon it. I'm not sure if this is common, but this is probably one of the first campaigns I have experienced where the satrapies didn't revolt against the Seleucids. But a win is a win. I just want to take the opportunity to thank everyone again for their contributions to this wee series we've had, and for either watching it live or watching the recap now. These videos have been a lot of fun to make. Sadly though, if I'm being honest, the interactions and viewership have been pretty low for the hours of editing required, so this format will likely be shelved for the foreseeable. We will be starting a new Attila Total War immersive playthrough in the 1212 mod shortly, which we'll play through on my Twitch channel. You can find a link to that below in the description. But, for the last time in this playthrough, thank you very much for watching, chatting, and adding to this playthrough as The Council. If you do want to check any of my other content we're regularly uploading, I appreciate it. Take care of yourselves, and toodle pip for now.